During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, she faced many plots and threats to her throne. But her most serious contender to deal with was Mary Queen of Scots. The Catholic Scottish Queen was championed by many inside of England, and they wanted her on the throne at the expense of the Protestant Elizabeth. But when these plots were discovered, many people were sentenced to death and were executed for their treason. One man who was subject to execution on Tower Hill, the brutal public beheading spot in London, was the Queen's second cousin, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk. But why was someone so close to the Queen executed? Join us today as we find out, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Thomas Howard was born on the 10th of March 1536, and as a child he was given a brilliant Protestant education and was taught by John Foxe, who later published the Book of Martyrs, which became the second best-selling book in the Tudor period behind the Bible. His father, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was a very influential Tudor courtier, and he was prominent at Henry VIII's court and was a key advisor to the king. Also, he was the uncle of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and with this helped to manipulate his family into a very prominent position of power inside Tudor England. As mentioned, the 4th Duke Thomas was Elizabeth I's second cousin through her maternal grandmother. But whilst he was a young man, Thomas rose to the position of the Earl Marshal of England, and was then made the Queen's lieutenant in the north. With this it was a huge appointment, and he was seen as a skilled military commander. From February to July 1560, he was made the commander of the English army in Scotland, and he negotiated the Treaty of Berwick and later the Treaty of Edinburgh. He was a constant player at court, and was also present at court proceedings when evidence of plots involving Mary Queen of Scots was presented by Regent Moray at York, and was then head of this commission. However, he was a man who was married 3 times, and he lost all 3 of his wives, with them dying. His first wife was Mary Fitzalan, the daughter of the Earl of Arundel, and she died a year after their marriage, having given birth to a son. His second wife was also an heiress named Margaret Audley, and she was also rather powerful, and the pair had a number of children. But his third wife was the widow of the 4th Baron Dacres of Gillisland, but as mentioned, all of these marriages ended in his wife dying. But Thomas Howard, always desperate for power and influence, then came up with a dangerous plot to possibly marry Mary Queen of Scots. He then became involved in something known as the Ridolfi Plot. This was a plan hatched by Roberta Ridolfi, in which Elizabeth I would be assassinated and then replaced with Mary Queen of Scots as the Queen of England. Ridolfi was an international banker that travelled between Catholic countries to rally and gather support. Thomas Howard was proposed as a possible husband for Mary, since she was imprisoned in 1568 in England. This suited the Duke of Norfolk, as he had big ambitions, and he was worried that Elizabeth I did not value him as a courtier and as a powerful landowner. But he wanted more power, and he agreed to support a northern rebellion which would occur against Elizabeth I. The plan for him to marry Mary Queen of Scots was that the Catholic Queen of Scotland would then be married to a cousin of Elizabeth and the wealthiest landowner in the country. They together would have a very strong claim to the English throne. A rebellion would rise up in the north to support the pair. However, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, then lost his nerve. Ridolfi had come up with a huge European plan to have a foreign invasion hit the shores of England, led by the Duke of Alba, who would form a rebellion and then murder Elizabeth, and then marry Mary to Thomas Howard. It was believed that the Catholics in England would support this and give their support to the plot, and despite being Protestant, Howard gave his consent to the plan. But Howard, as mentioned, panicked, and the plan did fail, and he was then informed on, and Elizabeth's government discovered his plans to marry Mary Queen of Scots. Elizabeth I was understandably furious with this, as she believed her cousin was trying to have her assassinated and then thrown off the throne. Thomas Howard's servants were all taken to the Tower of London, as was the Duke of Norfolk, and his servants, being seen as lower class, were then subject to torture. It's believed they may have been put on the rack, and under this immense pain and suffering, they confirmed that their master had been plotting to overthrow the English Queen and her government. Thomas Howard was himself held inside the Tower of London, and was then brought to trial in January 1572. The evidence against him was compelling, and it was clear that he was complicit in an international plot to kill the Queen then marry the woman who would take over. But despite being a nobleman, the jury of 26 other nobles found Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, guilty of treason. He was condemned to die by the jury, and it was rumoured that he would be executed on the final day of January, and because of this the Tower of London and Tower Hill experienced a huge flock of people desperate to see his execution on Tower Hill. He was spared being hanged, drawn and quartered, and was allowed a simpler beheading, which was considered quicker and more straightforward and less painful. But it was said that Elizabeth was dithering about signing Thomas Howard's death warrant, as she was torn between justice and the fact Norfolk's nearness of blood and his superiority of honour troubled her, with the fact he was her cousin. However, she signed the death warrant on the 9th of February, much later than it was believed she would, because of this debate. But further debate and talks took place as a new parliament gathered in May 1572, and they debated the case for and against executing Norfolk. Some stated that if the Queen failed to execute the Duke, then the Queen was saying that she deemed the guilty verdict incorrect, and was in a sense dishonouring the judgment of her nobles, and saying that she was above the law and she could do as she pleased. Elizabeth continued to dither about Howard's execution, but the Queen's mind was finally changed as she faced pressure from Parliament, and with this she ordered Thomas Howard's execution. In the meantime, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, may have believed that he would have been spared and been given a royal pardon. He remained inside of the Tower of London during this, and he then, on the 2nd of June 1572, was summoned by the Constable of the Tower, and was informed that his execution would take place within the hour. He was told to ready himself and be prepared for his execution. He had had a long time to get his affairs in order, but he was then led by the Tower's guards out of the Tower on the short walk north to Tower Hill. It was on the public beheading spot that he would be executed. The crowds lined the streets, and he made his way up onto the scaffold. He was confronted there by the executioner and the wooden block, and he then paid the executioner before he made a speech to the crowd. Final arrangements were made for his death, and then he was laid down on the block. His head was taken off by the axeman, who performed his killing swiftly, and then his head was shown to the crowd. Thomas Howard was the influential and powerful 4th Duke of Norfolk, who was considered one of the largest landowners inside of Elizabeth I's England. He was a man who, despite being a Protestant, had large ambitions to become the ruler himself, and by agreeing to marry Mary Queen of Scots and deposing his cousin Elizabeth I, he was committing treason. Elizabeth eventually would deal with Mary following the Babington Plot, as the Scottish monarch was executed inside the walls of Fotheringay Castle. With this, the Queen stamped out her threat forever and secured her safety on the throne, despite the criticism she got from this. But it's clear that she was unsure about the execution of Thomas Howard, and she took a long time to sign his death warrant and order the execution. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.